Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How are you guys? It's been far too long since I've spoken about X-Wing. In fact, it's been about a week since we put out an X-Wing video, and clearly you guys want some more. So we're going to sit down tonight and have another discussion about the game in general, a bit of a one-on-one chat. And I want to talk about aces, because aces is a term that's bandied around by the players and by FFG, and it's a term that's used differently in different contexts. And it's actually worth coming to an understanding of why it is referred to in these different ways. And specifically, from my point of view, from the point of view of the more learned players, why we use this term, what it refers to in ships and pilots, and how aces function in X-Wing lists. Now, the first thing I'm going to say before we start this video is, it does not matter what you call an ace and what you don't call an ace. It's just semantics. Newer players, you're going to meet a lot of people out there who are quite pedantic, who think you can call this an ace, you can't call this an ace, whatever. It actually doesn't matter. It is just semantics. What's important is the meaning behind the word. And when you start to learn the concept behind it and how you build your lists, it's going to make a lot more sense, and from that point of view, it is important to learn what it means, but actually how you use it in everyday speak, it doesn't really matter. Because when we're talking about how FFG use the word aces, particularly in their articles referring to expansion packs, it pretty much just means the highest pilot skill pilot on any given ship. They refer to that as their ace, often in their articles. For example, on the Hawk 290, they'll refer to Jan Ors as the ace in that pack, but Jan Ors doesn't really fit the role of an ace per se when we're talking about list building. In the Skirg Bomber, they would say Captain Nim is an ace, and Nim's kind of in a weird spot. He sort of is, sort of isn't an ace. And this is important to know because you're going to read these articles, you're going to hear players use the word ace, and you might get confused. So it's important to understand the distinction between those things. It's also important to understand that when we get things that sort of fill these ace requirements in some ways, but not other, a lot of discussion comes from that. A lot of people sort of get into arguments with other people about, oh, this is an ace, or all these cards makes this thing an ace. No more so than with the card Talonbane Cobra. Scum specifically is a faction that does not have many aces, and Talonbane Cobra has always been a point of contention for a lot of people, and it's certainly in my eyes, Talonbane Cobra does not fit the role of an ace, but we'll get to that later on. First of all, I actually just want to talk about that because I play the Scum faction. I have played it ever since I started playing the game in early 2016, and back then the faction had simply flat out no aces. Until Wave 9 came around and we got this little guy right here, the Protectorate Starfighter, often referred to as the Fang Fighter, specifically with the pilots Fenn Rau and Old Terok. But before that, we had not many things going on. We didn't have many high pilot skill guys. In fact, Talonbane Cobra and Dengar, I think, was the only pilot skill 9s on the faction. And I kind of learned the hard way about what is and isn't an ace, because in Wave 8 we had the Jump Master released. And along with that pack came the pilot Manaroo. Now, obviously, Manaroo is not an ace. That's what I'm talking about in this video. But Manaroo is interesting because the way I saw it and the way it turned out to be, Manaroo sort of fills the function of this big, heavy support for aces. Kind of like a Palp Shuttle, but with less insurance and a little bit more of a blunt instrument than the Palp Shuttle, I want to say. It's not just copying an Imperial concept. It's giving you a bit more efficiency with tokens, but the ability to, back then, change the dice on the fly. There was nothing else like that, but nonetheless, Manaroo was this great high-value support ship that went on the Scum faction. I thought to myself, brilliant, this clearly is designed to go along two aces. And I flew that alongside Cavill with VI to get him up to pilot skill 9 and Talonbane Cobra. Needless to say, it didn't go too well. With my limited understanding of the game, I looked at a list like Palp Aces and I thought, Manaroo kind of gives the Scum faction a Palp Aces-like list. And the reality was, while Manaroo may have sort of filled the role of the Palp Shuttle, the aces that went along with it were not really aces, and they didn't really fill the same role as the Imperial aces do. Later on, we had the list Old Fenaroo because the Protectorate Starfighter came out, and it came with two very competent ace pilots in Fenn Rau and Old Terok. And that's where that list came about. We don't really see that much these days because Manaroo got the nerf. Oddly enough, so did Emperor Palpatine, although Emperor Palpatine is still perfectly usable and is still getting used in high tier lists. Manaroo, not so much, sadly. But yeah, being a Scum player, aces are not a big thing that we have. And I think for newer players entering into the game, if you are not flying Imperial, you have to face the fact that you don't really have access to a lot of aces, particularly in the Scum faction. You pretty much just have the one ship. With the Rebel faction, it's a bit tough as well. Yes, there's the A-Wing. There's sort of the T-70 X-Wing kind of fills that role, but again, it's a bit of a build around and not really strictly what we consider an ace. So moving forward, let's talk about what an ace is, and particularly why it is most predominantly found on the Imperial faction. I mean, just in terms of lore, look, we're talking about the Empire. They had the biggest infrastructure in the galaxy. They had the most control over the core worlds. They had the most control over flight education. So it's no surprise that their organized army with that much resources is going to foster the most aces out of any one of the factions. The Rebels do obviously have aces as well, but because they're a bit more limited with their resources, they don't quite have the backing of the Empire, they don't have as many aces. And the Scum faction, of course, is just a hodgepodge of different characters, or from all around the galaxy. And from that point of view, they have the least amount of aces. It actually makes the most sense the way they've been implemented into the game. So in terms of giving these pilots with high pilot skills, with relevant abilities on the Empire, on a faction where ships are designed to capitalize off ace-like abilities, high pilot skills, and the like, it makes the most sense that they appear on this faction. Aces basically function on a list as a do-everything ship. They can arc dodge, they can token haul, they can fight, they can be your win condition. They pretty much are always the win condition on ace lists. They can shut down opponent strategies by simply flying in such a way that doesn't allow your opponent to shoot, doesn't get in range of their automatic damage in bombs or other upgrades. They can just deny turrets through things like auto thrusters. They are a huge toolbox ship that can basically take over the game by themselves. And they are, in the terms of list building, highly prioritized in the amount of points you stack onto them. No more so when you look at lists for things like Sunta Fel or Vader. I'll put them up on the screen here for you guys to see. Particularly in builds like this one with Sunta Fel, we are stacking 8 points onto a ship with only 3 hit points, which seems very scary, but the reality is with aces, this is what you do. You're building a win condition by basically saying this ship is not going to get hit, it's going to do all the work by itself, and it's going to just destroy my opponent's squad all by itself, or at least with a small number of them. In the example of Palp aces, you use 2 of them, or triple Imperial aces, of course, uses 3, as the name suggests. Builds like this, builds like things you put on Darth Vader, can often stack a lot of points onto one ship, and that's because it can function under the weight of that many points. A lot of other lower priority ships can't do that. If you stack this many points on ships like that, they can often get killed too quickly and all those points become wasteful. A very common mistake by rookies in list building. You've got to be very careful with that kind of stuff. Aces is one of those weird situations where you can push them more points wise. There are other examples of that as well, but we'll talk about those in other videos. Aces, of course, have good stats across the board. Often a lot of red dice, but pretty much always a lot of green dice. That's probably the most important thing. When you prioritize a ship that much, you have to be able to defend. It's super, super important. Pretty much always 3 green dice. There are a couple of sorted exceptions to this rule, but by and large, we're looking at 3 green dice. And moving on to these abilities, this is all about adaptation. This is all about efficiency, action economy. And when it's not about those things, it usually relies on heavy, heavy defense. Let's go back to Sunta Fel, because this is a great classic example of a good ace ability. Whenever you take a stress token, you may take a free focus token. Now, of course, this guy always takes push to limits. There is no question you basically never put any other EPT on this guy. I don't think that's ever going to change, at least not anytime soon, because that allows you to focus, push limit to evade to get another focus token, 2 focus tokens and an evade token, along with auto thrusters, stealth device. This guy just basically never gets hit during attacks. Sunta Fel has dropped out of the meta recently, mainly because of bombing. It's a massive weakness on a ship with such fewer hit points. But you get the basic idea. You get the idea that he's so efficient, he's defensive, He has a massive action economy, and that's just really everything this ship wants to be doing. Let's go back to Vader, because Vader is the original ace in the game of X-Wing. And I get the impression that FFG didn't really prioritize this concept when they first made the game, but soon after Wave 1 came out, they understood the value of having good action economies, good abilities to token horde on these ships with great dials and whatnot. And taking 2 actions per turn is no joke. It is fantastic. And it means you can do a combination of any 2 of target lock, focus, barrel roll, or evade. And what the upshot of all this is, Vader pretty much always arc dodges when he can. And this is really the genesis of what these aces are about. X-Wing quickly turned into a game, and still is to this day, especially with lists that don't use bombing, that rely heavily on attacks, that is all about making sure you attack physically more times than your opponent. And when you have aces like Vader, Sunterfell, whatever, that have the ability to barrel roll and do it effectively, you're not really giving up much when you have 2 actions on Darth Vader to make sure that you get your guy out of arc of your opponent, called arc dodging more commonly. It's going a long way to what aces want to be doing, and that's another thing I want to talk about, arc dodging, because this is dependent on a few things. First of all, the actions that the ship can take. We're talking boost, barrel roll. We're talking arc dodging, particularly barrel roll. Boost is more about range, where arc dodging is about keeping things in and out of your arc, or your ship in and out of your opponent's arc. And that becomes a very high priority action, and pretty much the reason that barrel roll is on pretty much every ace in the game, or at least what we consider aces. But of course, that's not the only thing when we're talking about arc dodging. We also have to think about the dial and the pilot skill. This is where the pilot skill becomes super important, because the higher the pilot skill, the later your ace is going to fly, and the later you have to prioritize those actions, the later it flies, the better idea you have about the board state. Because if your opponent flies all their ships before your ship, you're having a great time with your ace, because he can barrel roll, he can arc dodge, and your opponent has no more ships left to fly, so they cannot get that ship back in arc. In fact, it's one of the main reasons that people often default back to cards like Veteran Instincts, even if they're not running their own aces, because being able to beat out the pilot skill of your opponent's ace, even if you're not running any, is very potent for this reason. If you can prevent your opponent who's running aces from arc dodging, it becomes a very powerful thing. And that's why pilot skill, dial, and actions are all very important on aces. Positioning is basically, in many cases, the difference between being utterly devastated by an ace or defeating it. If you have low pilot skill ships, in many cases, the best way to beat aces is just to block them, to force them to lose their actions, and to shoot them at close range. It can be really tough otherwise. And in turn, if you're the one flying aces, that can be a thing to look out for. You have to be so careful. Particularly newer players, I notice. This is such a big, important part of what makes an ace. And I was talking before about things that are often referred to as aces, which arguably aren't. And I think this, out of everything else, is what we need to discuss, because again, Talonbane Cobra, this is a card that people bandy around as saying, oh look, Scum had an ace before the Protectorate Starfighter. When the Vaxi title was revealed for the Kirax fighter, we thought, oh, Talonbane Cobra's getting a fix, we can fly him like an ace, he's amazing. And the reality is, this is the biggest drawback for Talonbane Cobra. This is why you can't really function him like an ace. I'm not saying Talonbane Cobra is an unplayable card, not by any stretch of the imagination, but trying to fly him like an ace is a bit of a trap for newer players. I actually spoke about this the very first video I made on this channel. The main reason you generally don't fly Talonbane Cobra as an ace is because of this guy right here. If you were to say stack on Push the Limits, vectored thrusters, engine upgrades, auto thrusters onto Talonbane Cobra, what you're left with is a more expensive version of Fenn Rau that is not as good. And I know that sounds really harsh, but that's just the reality of it. His dial's way worse. His action bar catches up to Fenn Rau, but you've spent more points than the buy-in cost of Fenn Rau to do that. I've heard the argument that, hey, we can do this because we are offered redundancy for Fenn Rau. We cannot fly 2 Fenn Raus, so let's fly a Fenn Rau and a Fenn Rau Light, and even that is not really a concept I can get behind. X-Wing is not really a game that plays around with redundancy that well. We don't have a rotating format. We don't have a lot of use for redundant pilot cards, ships, whatever. And look, that's a discussion for a whole other video. I might talk about redundancy a bit more later on, but this is largely why I want to talk about this subject, because I think this aspect alone is a bit of a trap for some people. And just comparing Talonbane Cobra and Fenn Rau on their cards, you can see how, oh look, they look very similar. Oh, they might fly similarly when we build them out. No, they don't, unfortunately. It's a bit of a pain, but that's something you have to think about. And from that point of view, when you're building out Talonbane Cobra, build them a different way. The Vaxi title gives it a lot of utility options. It's got an illicit slot. It's got a missile slot. It can do a lot of other cool things that don't involve trying to force it down the path of being an ace. But what about those pilots that sort of fill the role of an ace, but sort of don't? And I'm not talking about Talonbane Cobra. I think I've made my main case as to why I don't consider him an ace. But one of the main reasons I wanted to have this discussion today is because of a list that's doing very well in some local regionals, particularly here in Australia and a bit more around the world. But this is the Palp Aces list that runs the Inquisitor and Quick Draw. And Quick Draw is a very interesting case because he doesn't really fill all these requirements. He does not roll 3 green on his agility, and he does not have the world's best dial. He doesn't have the world's best dial, and he doesn't have any inbuilt special economy. He's a very, very aggressive ship, and it's a bit hard to say. Back in the day, back in late 2016, we had 2 different main archetypes with Palp Aces list. In fact, we had one Palp Aces list and we had Palp Defenders, often known as Commonwealth Defenders. And this was interesting because we had an archetype that used Emperor Palpatine, but Defenders aren't strictly aces. They don't really play around with all the same kind of rules as aces, but they still really do work well with Emperor Palpatine. And in 2016, the Commonwealth Defenders list actually took the Australian Nationals. The reason they don't really fit this role is because they're actually designed to take a bit more punishment. They're not designed to just flat out ignore damage to arc dodge, and they don't generally have high pilot skills. And Quick Draw kind of sits in the middle of all this because Quick Draw has pilot skill 9, he has a barrel roll, his dial's not amazing, and his ability doesn't really give him any action economy. It does give him some great attack economy. But being pilot skill 9 and still functioning in this list in this kind of way, still relying heavily on positioning, he kind of treads the line between what the Defenders used to be and what Palp Aces is now with its ace list. I mean, look, the Inquisitor in this list, yes, absolutely an ace. Does everything we talked about before. But Quick Draw is an interesting case because he kind of functions like an ace sometimes and then kind of doesn't because he's happy to take damage and then shoot back. And that fills the role of what I would call a brawler, which we'll talk about in another video. But I just find that very interesting, the way aces have sort of morphed over time. And I think this is largely because of the bombing meta, because of a lot of the direct damage from the pure offensiveness of lists like Kanan and Fenn Rau. There's a need for aces in some examples, but we also need aces that can take a bit of punishment and dish it back and win damage races, which sounds kind of weird. Look, in this list, you don't want the Inquisitor getting shot, but Quick Draw kind of does want to get shot, and he's kind of treading this weird line between ace and brawler, and I just find that really fascinating. And to be perfectly honest, as I said, I am a scum player. I have not flown this list much. So look in the comment, guys. If any of you guys have flown this list, how do you find Quick Draw? How do you find he functions as an ace or as a brawler? Does he arc dodge much? Does he fight? Do you want him to lose the shield? Do you not want him to lose the shield? And it's just there just in case. I'm really curious to see how a lot of you guys fly this because I haven't seen it in action that much, but it is a very interesting case. Another interesting thing about aces about how they've been flown in the recent meta is what they're flown alongside. Obviously, we've had the Palp shuttle for a very, very long time. It still works, it's still very effective. But towards the start of the year, we had this list flying around. Kylo Ren and 2 Rogue Squadron pilots. We have 2 Alpha Strikers and an ace, and this is really, really cool. Again, it's something we haven't really seen before when we fly aces alongside Alpha Strikers. Kylo is very much an ace, but again, he has this ability where he actually is incentivized to get shot. which is bizarre. And what I've noticed with Kylo Ren, it is a fantastic ship, it's a fantastic ability, is you have to fight really hard to get damage through on this guy, but when you do, he punishes you, which is really, really cool. It's a new direction of the design of aces that FFG have taken, and that's really made things very interesting. And it's kind of blurred the line of what we understand aces to be. Because, look, as a community, we have this understanding. Everything I talked about at the start of the video, that's what we understand aces to be. But FFG are always trying to push the envelope of how we understand these things. Yes, they can arc dodge, they have this great action economy, but some of them actually benefit you from getting shot, and that's just... it's bizarre, but it offers interesting new list building potential, because if we just give the Empire more aces, they'll just get cut and pasted into palp aces, and that's not exciting. Even with the Scum and Rebel faction, aces have their place that they're commonly flown, and just giving us more of the same just isn't really what they want to be doing. But all in all, guys, to sum up, it isn't really important to understand what aces are so you refer to them properly in conversation, so you look intelligent in front of the really good players. It's important to understand the concept behind them, because you need to understand how they function in list building, how to fly against them. They can be a lot of fun to fly with, they can be very frustrating to fly against, but essentially these are things that you need to find a way to deal with. You need to find a way to prioritize, otherwise they can run away with games. And particularly with the more experienced players who understand a bit better about positioning, about setting up situations, about planning turns ahead, aces can be a really, really fun toolbox to learn how to use, to harness, and to build lists around. Anyway, guys, thank you so much for watching. I'm going to do some more videos on various types of ships and builds in the future. Let me know what you thought of this in the comments. If there's anything you want me to chat about in later videos, let me know. But in the meantime, thank you for watching. Like and subscribe. Like us on Facebook. Follow us on Twitter. And I will catch you later.